As we know, poverty is multidimensional, constrains not only people's finances, but also their capabilities and their agency, as Jennifer just nicely laid out. And Amartya Sen would call these their freedoms. He wrote that expanding these freedoms are not only the primary means of development, they are also among its principal means. But it's only recently that we've seen a science around this topic of expanding agency for anti-poverty efforts, building people's psychosocial capabilities. So my collaborators at Ashoka University Center for Social and Behavior Change, and I just recently conducted a narrative review of the literature in 3 different domains of agency building interventions. So these include brief psychologically targeted interventions on aspirations and agency. These include things like role modeling videos and group discussions. Another is multi-session psychologically targeted interventions, for instance, teaching an entrepreneurial mindset or personal initiative. Another set is teaching things like self-efficacy. And then the last is a much broader array of life skills that are taught, or soft skills that are taught in multi-session interventions. And these teach things like goal setting, problem solving, leadership, interpersonal communication. We identified over 36 RCTs in this area, half of which have been published in the last 3 years. So this is a rapidly growing area of research. And in that review, we found particularly strong evidence for interventions and trainings focused on aspirations and goal setting. So for instance, goal setting was one of the most represented life skills among RCTs that have found positive effects. However, there was quite a bit of variation in effectiveness. Some studies showed particularly strong effects, and some showed nulls. As one example of the latter in the domain of education, one large-scale cross-cultural study of 8,000 students assessed impacts of what's called mental contrasting and implementation intentions, which is goal-setting intervention. They did this with students, and they found that this intervention was quite effective in the US, replicating past studies. However, it failed to motivate students to increase educational attainment in India and China. And while this is an example in the domain of education and not anti-poverty efforts, I show it because it's a rare cross-cultural study and one that took a cultural lens. So the authors conducted follow-up surveys with students in India and the US to try to understand why it didn't work in India. And what they found that, Indian students saw their personal academic goals, as secondary to fulfilling social obligations and roles, like helping their parents out with chores at home. And they also found relational goals to be more motivating than personal goals. So things like not disappointing one's parents as a motivator for educational attainment. So what this suggests is that those relational processes, those relational concerns, weren't present in the intervention design. That might be one reason that this intervention wasn't effective. So many scholars have written on functional forms of interdependence that exist in low resource global contexts. Dr. Stephen Ajay, who's a Ghanaian social and cultural psychologist, writes that in the African epistemic worldview, the person is ontologically part of the social firmament, as the dichotomy between the individual and the social is indistinguishable. In contrast to a self-creating view of agency, in which the person is abstracted from social context and considered as a center of his or her own awareness and intentional actions, which he's saying is kind of the default in the West. He's saying what's present in his context is negotiated agency, which involves engaging in joint decision-making and being responsive to expectations and demands of relational others in a network of interconnectedness. So what he's describing here, the dichotomy, reflects 2 models of self and agency that have been explored in the cultural psychological literature. So in an independent model, the self is seen as separate and autonomous from other people. People are seen as unique, as free, as equal. And the model of agency that's more present and practiced entails the pursuit of individual goals and interests. And Jennifer's work teed me up nice for this part. And in contrast, in an interdependent model of self and agency, people are more, they see themselves as the boundary between the self and others is less distinguished. And that's what Dr. Steve Ajay was just noting in this prior slide. And so people are seeing they have a more interdependent sense of self, and their sense of agency accordingly is more interdependent. So people are more driven to pursue social roles, obligations, to meet social norms and expectations. Recent work by Thomas Telholm and others situates responsibilism. This idea that being responsible to others, fulfilling your responsibility to others, is one of the defining characteristics of collectivism. So given this, when we're thinking about agency, you can imagine that there might be some possible tensions in people pursuing agency and self-advancement. So people in more interdependent contexts, they might wonder, will being ambitious prevent me from fulfilling my social obligations or cause tension in my relationships? By trying new behaviors that deviate from the norm, will others see me as disrespectful or immoral? So this is what we're trying to address in our interventions, our psychological interventions. Call them culturally wise interventions. These are social psychological interventions that attend to these construals, these subjective construals, and to the ways they systematically vary across cultural contexts. So specifically, we offer subjective construals of an opportunity, like one for economic advancement, as aligning with, rather than conflicting with, people's cultural self-ways, goals, and values. So let me jump into the studies here. I'll show results from two separate papers, one published and one forthcoming. And the title of the talk had "How" in it. And I really want to talk about how we design these interventions and how they unfold. So this is the context that we're working in. This is Niger. It's one of the lowest income countries globally. It's currently at the front line of climate change. So I had the opportunity to work with the government to implement a national program to combat extreme poverty and hunger among low-income rural women, in part through supporting small businesses. And what I want to note about this population is that women live in remote, low literacy and low resource environments. So as such, their economic opportunities and supports often come through their relationships. More broadly, this is a interdependent sociocultural context with strong gender norms. So 90% of women agreed or strongly agreed that one must take others' opinions into account when making a decision. 71% said they would rather be known for being respectful to others than economically successful. I think that, oops, sorry. And that one was particularly surprising to me given the depth of poverty in this context. Then building on formative, qualitative, and quantitative data, we crafted some questions on mental models of women's economic agency. We asked, what drives women's economic success or entrepreneurial success in this context? And we gave them 4 factors to rank, as you see on the x-axis. 2 of them related to more independent factors we commonly study in the US. Self-initiative and hard work is also reflected in programs like personal initiative trainings, entrepreneurial trainings. And then 2 we got from our qualitative research, particularly social connections and peacefulness, or social and inner harmony. When we asked women this question in a large survey, we found that they ranked these more interdependent factors as more important than independent factors. They rated self-initiative as the least important factor, peacefulness as the most. We also collected data in the US as a point of comparison, and we asked US participants to predict what they thought would be the most important factor for women's success in Niger. And we find that, as we would expect from the Western literature, they ranked self-initiative as the most important factor, and more generally, these independent factors as higher than the interdependent or relational factors. Okay, so we flipped this question on its head, and we asked about barriers to women's economic success, again, with 4 different factors. Women in Niger, again, rated these more interdependent factors, not respecting others, and tension in the household as the top barriers, and the independent factor of not being future-minded, not planning for the future, not being persistent as the least. And again, we saw that in the US, they rated this factor that women in Niger rated as the least important, as the most important, not being future minded. And this more relational factors is generally less important than the independent factors. So here we see in each area that these relational factors are really taking the stage in people's mental models of what would drive women's economic success. So given this cultural context, we next wanted to devise culturally wise psychological interventions to boost agency with these mental models and values in mind that offered a way of seeing women's entrepreneurship as a way to foster, to support respect and generosity in the household and in the village. So we test 3 different interventions at different levels. So in the policy experiment, we test interventions at the community level through a community development discussion. We also test group-based training, so life skills trainings. And then in a separate mechanism experiment, we also test individual level construals of entrepreneurship. And I'll get to that in a bit. So in our policy experiment, we were able to test 3 different variations of the National Safety Net Program and compare them to a control. So all 3 treatment conditions received a core package of economic interventions. These are based on kind of the gold standard at this point, the graduation model. So this included savings, business trainings, and other livelihood supports. The first condition added to that a unconditional cash transfer of about $300. The second condition, instead of adding that cash, it added 2 psychosocial interventions, which I'll get to next. And the third put it all together in the full package. And then we compared this to the control, which is their normal National Safety Net Program, providing a small monthly stipend. Then we looked at effects 1 and 2 years later. So what were these psychosocial interventions? I'll show you some pictures from a few places in West Africa where this program is being tested. So the first intervention was a community event designed to introduce the program to the village. And I worked with a Senegalese filmmaker to script and shoot a realistic fiction about a woman named Amina. So I want to show you a clip of this because I know that it's after lunch in the afternoon. And let me see how this works.
Mayina, ay no kan cin gida ay kun si ba mara. Ya kina ga isi ba halin yin kwani zan kai lako.
Ni ka ai gola saboni ga. Ma ai koi galuno. An bara ki zo ina to sen ko kan yi hankara da.
Ai wo dai gadu. Aran mai no dama kana ran gani aran jira wo disi. Ai fere din yana yi. An baga inda wo isi yanda bari.
Ayan bai zan mai no gani. Ta hage bare gani mo dole an bare. An ko haku ko yon bonde ne ka saboda wai bai gonge magen dela. Ai di mo mago din gurde. Inga kai mo sintin gure mari zan kai kwande habu. Ai gure waga bizan kwanda habu. Kalmos mo sai sintin gure dele zan ga dan kan buganji. Alai sintin gure almane da dai.
Ai sabo ina. Mu fata ran mu karan kai sai aran ne zan fere. Kuso aran di.
So Amina has been shown to pursue this business. She overcomes a series of interpersonal and economic challenges. And in the end, she shares with other women in her savings groups what she's learned. So I'll play with that.
Matakai ini da gabar mai ku ya nuna ilhima ilmin goda ilmin kokari na dabarai barmai. I sabe.
So after this, the community that viewed this film was then led through a guided discussion in the style of Llewellyn to connect their values to what they saw in the film. And Specifically, to tie this activity of business to values like respect of elders, generosity towards others. And then they were asked to support each other in pursuing that goal and to pursue a better future for the next generation. Women then participated in group-based life skills trainings, again, where they learned things like goal setting, interpersonal communication, and problem solving. And to make this training more culturally wise as well, these skills are tied back to interdependent values throughout. Okay, so what do we find? Let's look at impacts on poverty 2 years later after these interventions were delivered. As a rough benchmark, we can think of extreme poverty was defined as living on $1.90 or less per person per day. And then the control group people are living on about $1.70 per person per day. So significantly increased in the So this is significantly increased in that capital package where they got that large unconditional cash transfer amounting to about 80% of a person's annual consumption. Now let's look at what happens when we substitute out that large cash transfer for those two psychosocial interventions. We find that it performed just as well. Suspense is building. So it performed just as well. And when we added it all together in the full package, we find that this showed significantly higher impacts in both the capital and control conditions, suggesting that those psychosocial interventions had a marginal impact on their own and bringing households up to about $1.95 per person per day. We also found that these three variations of the program reduced food insecurity. So in the capital and psychosocial conditions alike, households were 20% less likely to experience severe hunger, like going an entire day without food. One of the reasons that these psychosocial interventions are so appealing from a policy perspective is that they showed similar effects to the capital package, but they did so at a fraction of the cost. So the benefit to cost ratio was 3 to 1. So those are impacts on consumption alone versus costs incurred for program delivery. And this is actually a conservative estimate looking at consumption alone. So what we see here is that the material resources commonly given in anti-poverty programs, that they might be necessary, but not particularly efficient. So at this point, you might be wondering how these psychosocial interventions worked. So we'll look at some of the psychosocial outcomes of the psychosocial package, which compared to control, which might point us to possible mechanisms of economic impacts. So we see positive effects on several interpersonal outcomes, things like self-efficacy, optimistic future expectations, and mental health. We see similarly positive and in some cases larger effects on these more relational processes related to social capital and social influence. So women join more community organizations, they held posts in them, they had a greater number of people they could go to for support. They felt that social norms were shifting in their favor towards women engaged in business, and they felt that they had higher social standing. We see several economic mechanisms consistent with this constellation of psychosocial factors. So we see greater effort and productivity in business, greater future-oriented investments, more social capital, and actually positive spillover on other members of their household. That was an unexpected effect, but it suggests that women were seeds of change within the household as well. So these are many different outcomes, all measured contemporaneously. We want to get to some causality. So let me show you an embedded experiment that we ran within this large policy experiment. So we went back to some of the women who participated in these psychosocial interventions, and we randomized them to an individual level intervention. Some received a kind of status quo, independent initiative, or personal initiative intervention, which emphasizes this independent construal of entrepreneurship. The other received what we consider to be more culturally wise, more interdependent view of entrepreneurship. And then we looked at outcomes 1 year later. So in each intervention arm, participants would watch a 4-minute video on a tablet, and then the surveyors would lead them through a goal setting exercise. So in the first film that centers self-advancement and self-direction, Amina is described as being proactive in pursuing her goals. She's innovative in her products. She plans out her finances herself, and she's strategic in the marketplace. Her goals are to advance her socioeconomic status and become a standout entrepreneur. Women are then led through a guided exercise based on that middle contrasting implementations intentions intervention, where they plan, they identify effective entrepreneurial strategies, they visualize and set personal goals, and then they problem solve around possible obstacles to those goals, making if-then statements for possible obstacles that could arise. Now, the second intervention showed the same series of images, slightly tweaked, to center around the ideas of collective advancement and social harmony that could be achieved through entrepreneurship. So in this clip of the film, women see that Amina is described as being peaceful, respectful, and generous in pursuing her goals. She collaborates with other women and her family, including her husband. And her goals are to advance her family's socioeconomic status and become a respected community member. So here again, we see this more interdependent model of agency, emphasizing relational harmony and responsiveness to social obligations. Here, the exercise has been adapted to focus on effective social strategies for maintaining harmony, for visualizing and setting collective goals, for problem solving around possible social obstacles. 1 year later, we were able to measure a subset of those economic outcomes on business outcomes and food security. And we find that the independent initiative intervention was directionally positive, but did not differ from the control. However, that interdependent initiative conditions showed a significant positive effect. We didn't find any differences across these two interventions, likely because we're not powered to detect such small effects. But together, these results suggest that tuning interventions to the interdependence in this context help drive these effects that we saw earlier on reducing poverty and hunger. And critically, they show that how we relied on the Western evidence base alone, more focused on self-advancement and self-direction, we might not have observed those impacts. We also measured some interpersonal and relational outcome measures. And we generally find, and I'm showing you just a couple examples here. So we find that both initiative interventions increase optimism for economic mobility. That's expected, both focused on goal setting and aspirations and role modeling those. However, we see that only the interdependent initiative intervention also improved this relational outcome, strengthening women's relationships in their households. So their closeness to their household, the respect they felt they received from others in their household. And so perhaps one way this interdependent initiative intervention was working was by helping women manage their relationships, their relational roles and obligations. This is similar to the pattern results we saw in the policy experiment, where we saw both interpersonal and relational processes being shifted simultaneously. So what we see in this set of studies in this more interdependent context is that interventions that accounted for an expanded model of agency, that includes shared agency with important others, and that helped women navigate their social worlds effectively, was most operational in this context. It best allowed women to pursue new economic opportunities. And more broadly, I think this work shows how an emerging field at the intersection of behavioral science, cultural psychology, and development economics can identify how to best advance agency and anti-poverty efforts across different cultural contexts. With that, I'd like to give a very big thanks to my very big research team and wonderful collaborators.
Open it up for some questions for Catherine.
That discussing this. I guess one, there is a bunch of work that you might think of, like stuff that's come out of the Heritage Lab, for instance, kind of pointing to cultural factors, how the collective resources, individual resources, different developments. But in the context of your particular,
Speak up a little bit.
sorry, I always thought of myself as so loud. I don't know how. Okay.
There we go.
Thank you. Yeah. I guess in this setting, I am not sure if I can separate this from the gender dimension. So two ways of asking that question. So for instance, if you had done the same thing with men, would the results have been so, different? And to take, something that I remember from reading the old Sheryl Sandberg book, about Lenin, right? Where she talks about if women have to get a raise, how did they have to pitch it, They couldn't say that, oh, I did this, and, they had to get a raise, they had to ask for it in terms of, oh, my team did this, right? So in the context of, I am not discounting the role of these the potential role of these collectives versus individual frames of looking at things. But in the context of this study, I'm finding it still hard to separate it from a gender dimension.
Absolutely, thank you. We would consider gender to be a culture as well, a cultural factor, that it organizes your experience and your psychology. But you're asking about individualism versus collectivism, and like my kind of pinpointing that as the dimension. So thank you for the question. I get that a lot. We don't treat men in this context, of course, as you saw, but I do have a very similar paradigm that I've done in Nairobi, Kenya, with the Busara Center on giving cash transfers and framing them different ways and more independent or interdependent approach. And we did not see moderation, heterogeneity, whatever you want to call it. We did not find that by gender. And in general, the cultural psychological literature finds that differences between genders within countries are much smaller than differences across countries in terms of cultural variation and models of self, agency, values, etc. So I think that there's probably still a culture effect. There could also be a gender effect within that. So I know that there is research, for instance, on women promoting each other as a means to support their kind of assertiveness in the workplace and promotion behaviors. So I could see it being a both and, but I agree that it'd be best in future studies to disentangle this. Thank you.
Sabrina Corum here at Berkeley. So when I think about why having a more culturally appropriate video might be helpful, I could think of one of two reasons. One might be that it couches it as a socially acceptable activity to achieve upward mobility. Like the type of person who does this is not a person who's rejecting communal values and so on. And I think, if I didn't misunderstand, it's possible you said when the main field experiment actually did change norms around entrepreneurship, like in the village, it's a good thing for women to do, which is different than how one ought to behave when engaging in that activity, right? Like I think the videos also said, oh, but if you're going to pursue these activities, don't share your knowledge with others. Do you think like the way you pursue it to be successful as an entrepreneur, your action should be community oriented, which is different than pursue the same exact actions, but let's just like market it as something that fits our values.
Yeah.
And those seem different to me. And it doesn't seem that you could, even the second experiment, because you had more entrepreneurship happen with the second group, it could be that's why they had, better outcomes. And so it doesn't seem like,
Because they use different strategies.
or just that they engaged in it to begin with, or whatever. So it seems like one can't disentangle whether the effects are just from you made this socially acceptable, so now I won't be ostracized, versus it actually changes anything about my behavior. And that seems relevant to kind of the hypothesis of, do we want people to behave in an individualistic way or not?
Yeah.
Does
So
that make sense?
It does. And I actually measured, for instance, redistributive behaviors, which would get to your second point, and we don't find any effects on that. I don't think that I measured it satisfactorily. It was an exploratory hypothesis because I wanted to see if it was changing how people pursued entrepreneurship and if they were being more redistributive, for instance, if they were sharing more. And we did not find effects on that. I will say there were some ceiling effects. People were very redistributive. But I do think it is more of a former because we see increases in social standing. And well, it could be, I guess, because of their behaviors, or I mean, I guess the same thing is a concern. But we do see that kind of my thought on the way that this is most likely to have occurred is that the kind of nodal mechanism is status. We see that status is correlated with basically every other social psychological measure that was shifted, as well as multiple dimensions of economic outcomes. And so I think that it is at least in part about them having greater social standing as for doing entrepreneurship.
Then does that require softening the hypothesis a little bit? Like say, I think going into the talk, I interpreted as growth mindset or the kind of things that we think are good are not culturally appropriate. But it seems that in fact, those are totally fine and that is how you achieve upward. Like, it could be that one could argue, but maybe those are fine. Maybe that is how everyone everywhere achieves upward mobility. But we need to be careful how we market it to people. But then, so I think I maybe was interpreting the hypothesis the stronger one than it actually is.
I do think it's about construal. That is my hypothesis. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Name is Raj Sivrar. I am in the ARE department PhD student. You showed the graph of.
And sorry, can I just,
Yeah,
the last point, is that in the individual level intervention, that is what we're doing. We're only shifting people's construals. I guess we still haven't we haven't measured all the possible behaviors in which they enacted entrepreneurship, but that is our IB.
Okay, so you showed the graph about the interdependent initiative intervention, increasing the quality of these household relationships. I'm curious if that also includes IPV measures and if you have the various types of IPV, if you have results on those.
Yeah, so we did not measure IPVs because of ethical reasons. You need to have a very well-trained field team to do that sort of work. But I did measure, include measures of perceptions of intimate partner violence in their community more broadly. And we find that those marginally reduce. So people think that there is less IPV happening within the community. We don't measure it at the individual level.
So a lot of the videos that we use for aspirations are usually in two categories, in entrepreneurship and education, right? And I guess my question is a little bit of a follow-up on Supreet's, and that how do we actually design the intervention itself, rather than just like the way that we describe the intervention, but interventions in entrepreneurialism and education so that they are more communal, because they both involve profits, right, which are very individual, or grades, which are very individual. So how do we actually, how can we actually create interventions themselves that make those activities more communal?
Yeah, I think about processes and benefits, and those are different. And I haven't disentangled them, and I'm not sure which is more important. So in one of the studies that I'm currently running, I'm really trying to tie individual advancement to shared collective benefits. So prompting people to think about how, for instance, if they opened a Sorry store in the Philippines, which is where I'm currently doing this work, how that might, for instance, allow people to not have to travel so far for basic needs. That's a collective benefit from your self-advancement. So that could be one way to do it. And the other is through more relational processes of bringing bringing other people along with you, which is, and then a negotiated agency, is making sure that you are, you're bringing your proximal others along with you in the processes and you're engaging them, which is what we see that they're doing in this work in entrepreneurship, that they're working with their family members and they're getting them to also benefit as individuals, not from the fruits of their labor, but their own fruits of their labor. So getting them to kind of do norm change within the household and spur that benefit for other people as well. I think there'd be two ways to think about it.
Thanks,
you.
Catherine.